The snow had swallowed everything. Madison Reed pushed forward through thigh-deep drifts, each step a silent war against the howling wind. Her Ranger radio crackled with static in her ear, distant voices reporting back from the other sectors of the Bitterroot Wilderness. Nothing. No signs of life, no footprints, no hope. She wasn't ready to call it yet. The storm had broken records. 30 years since Montana had seen anything like this. Roads vanished, cabins buried, and temperatures plummeting past -20. 3 days ago, the Callahan family had set out for a short winter hike from their rental cabin, a scenic loop marked and mapped. But no one expected the blizzard to arrive early, or with such fury. And now they were missing. Madison's breath fogged her ski goggles as she scanned the ridge ahead. Her legs ached. 12 hours into her patrol, and she'd found nothing but wind-blasted trees and the occasional downed branch. She tightened the scarf around her face and pressed on. Her boot hit something. Hard, she stopped, confused. A buried rock, maybe, but the shape, rounder, smoother. She crouched, brushing away snow with gloved hands. More of the surface revealed itself. A curve, dark and textured, not rock. Fur. She froze. Then her training kicked in, adrenaline firing as she dropped to her knees and started digging with both hands. Snow flung into the wind as her heart pounded faster than the storm around her. A muzzle, black and caked with frost, the stallion's nostrils barely moved. Madison leaned close, there, a whisper of breath. Barely more than vapor, but it was there. "Holy hell," she breathed. "You're alive." The horse was massive, coated in ice and snow like a statue carved from winter itself. His body lay in a shallow natural depression, partially shielded by trees. He must have been here for days. No wild animal should have lasted this long. She radioed in, voice tight with urgency. "Sector 12. I've got a live animal, large Mustang, critical condition. Possible connection to missing persons. Requesting med-evac support, over." Static, then silence. Of course, reception here was garbage. Madison looked down at the stallion again. His eyes were shut, lashes frosted white. But his body had shaped the snow around him in a strange way, like he'd been shielding something. She moved around to his side. There, just beneath the outer drift. The faintest impression in the snow, smaller than a man, but shaped like one. She knelt and began probing gently with her avalanche stick. Then she heard it. A whimper. She dropped everything and dug. Snow gave way to the edge of a jacket. Bright red, nearly frozen solid. She tore through the layers with her gloved hands until she found a face. Pale. Eyes shut. A little girl. "Holly," Madison whispered, voice trembling. "Holly Callahan?" The child stirred, barely. Lips blue. Skin cold as ice, but her pulse flickered under Madison's fingers like a ghost refusing to fade. Madison called into her dead radio anyway. "Found her. I have the daughter. Still breathing." She cradled the child against her as best she could and looked back at the stallion. He hadn't moved, but his massive body had clearly sheltered this child, blocking the wind, keeping the snow packed tight for insulation. She looked closer. Footprints. More impressions under the snow. Number. Not just the girl. Madison worked like a woman possessed, guided by the trail of shapes in the snow and the horse's body itself. 20 feet away, another child, a boy, Lucas, wrapped in what looked like a man's coat. He was unconscious but alive. Further beyond, 2 adult shapes, Nate and Elena Callahan, buried but breathing, barely clinging on. Nate had his arms around Elena, his back arched like a shield. She was curled beneath him. And the horse. Madison turned to the stallion. Still unmoving, still silent, but his breathing was slower now, fainter, like he had given everything. Not just warmth, but positioning, carefully lying across the drift to press heat where it would do the most good. He had saved them. All of them. Why? She whispered, kneeling beside him. You shouldn't have survived. You shouldn't have even tried. His eye cracked open, just enough to meet hers. There was no wild panic there, no fear, just something ancient and deep, a kind of resolve, like he needed to make sure someone knew what he'd done, that it had mattered. Madison touched his side gently. You held on for them. You knew. Her voice broke. Then, faint in the distance, blades, helicopters. She leapt up, waving her arms toward the sky, signaling. Emergency teams descended within minutes, rushing toward the Callahans. Shouts echoed through the trees, medics digging fast, wrapping the family in thermal blankets, assessing vitals. But Madison stayed with the stallion. Stay with me, big guy, she murmured as the chaos unfolded around her. You did your part. Now let us do ours. A medic crouched beside her. He's not going to make it. Madison didn't look away. He has to. And then, beneath the noise and the rush, a name came to her, uninvited but perfect. Valor, she whispered. He didn't move. But something about the silence felt different. As the last stretcher lifted off into the sky, Madison remained in the snow beside the dying horse, the storm finally breaking overhead, light bleeding through the clouds for the first time in days. They said the stallion wouldn't survive the flight, but he did. Barely. Madison Reed had ridden in the back of the helicopter, one hand gripping the IV bag, the other resting on the stallion's heaving side as the rotors beat against the frozen sky. His body was wrapped in thermal blankets, tubes snaking into his neck, and heat packs tucked around his core. The medic beside her monitored vitals with grim focus, muttering updates that made Madison's chest tighten. No reflex, shallow breaths, temps still dropping. They landed on the rooftop of the Bitterroot Valley Emergency Animal Center just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered hills. Waiting below was Dr. Jonah Wells, the best large animal trauma vet in the region, tall, broad-shouldered, with streaks of gray in his beard and eyes that had seen too many good horses die too soon. He took one look at the stretcher being rolled toward him and swore under his breath. Damn, he made it? Barely, Madison replied, her voice hoarse. Dr. Wells stepped beside her, examining the stallion with clinical efficiency. This horse should be dead, Ranger. Hypothermia, this severe, he must have burned through every reserve he had. He kept 4 people alive with his body heat, Madison said quietly. Jonah's hands paused. You serious? Madison nodded. A family. 2 kids. They're stable now because of him. Jonah stared at the stallion, then motioned his team forward. Let's try and return the favor. They rushed Valor into a specialized heated stall lined with soft padding and infrared warming panels. A young vet tech was already inside prepping equipment. Kendra Liu, 29, with quick hands and sharper instincts than most of the interns twice her age. She barely glanced up as she inserted the catheter and hooked up warmed IV fluids. We're walking a tightrope here, she said. Too fast, and we fry his organs. Too slow, and he crashes. Madison stood at the doorway, her boots still wet, snow melting down the back of her neck. Can I stay? Jonah nodded. But don't get your hopes up. Horses don't bounce back from this kind of exposure. Yeah, Madison said. But this isn't just a horse. The hours blurred. Kendra never left his side. She monitored his core temperature, heart rate, and breathing with unshakable focus. The medical staff worked in shifts, carefully increasing the warmth by fractions, trying to coax life back into Valor's shattered body without pushing too hard. At 2 a.m., his breathing stuttered. Kendra rushed to adjust the fluid rate. Madison held her breath. And then, slowly, the stallion's ear twitched. He's fighting. By morning, his temperature had risen a full degree. Word of the rescue had spread faster than wildfire. Local news ran the story before sunrise, followed by national outlets. Wild Horse saves family in historic blizzard, the headlines read. Madison's phone lit up with messages from journalists, colleagues, and strangers. She ignored them all. She stayed at the center. So did Kendra. By midday, donations were flooding in, blankets, food, offers of adoption from people who had never even seen a horse in person. But Valor was not out of the woods, not even close. That afternoon, a phone call came in from the trauma center where the Callahan family was recovering. Madison stepped outside the stall to take it. It was Elena Callahan. "We just told Holly and Lucas about the horse," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "They don't remember much, but Holly asked for him." Madison closed her eyes. "She'll see him again." "Is he still alive?" "Barely," Madison replied. "But he's holding on." There was a pause. Then, softly, "He's part of us now." That night, after checking Valor one last time, Madison walked out into the snow-covered parking lot and looked up at the sky. Stars blinked above her, cold and unblinking. The same stars Valor had laid under, dying, while keeping a family alive. She whispered into the night, "Come on, big guy. Don't stop now." At dawn, Kendra called her back into the stall. "He moved," she said. "Watch." Madison knelt beside the stallion. For a long moment he didn't stir. Then, slowly, weakly, his eye opened. He blinked once, then again. He turned his head just enough to look at Madison. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Valor." A quiet breath escaped his nose. He didn't lift his head, didn't move anything else, but he saw her. And in that look there was no panic, no wildness, just recognition. Madison reached for him, her hand shaking. She touched the side of his face. His skin was warm. For the first time since the blizzard, warm. Behind her, Kendra gave a breathless laugh. "I think he's going to make it." In a children's hospital across town, Holly Callahan sat up in bed, IV lines taped to her wrist. She looked at her parents and whispered, "Is the big horse okay?" Elena nodded through tears. "He just woke up." Holly smiled faintly. "I knew he would," he promised. The days following Valor's awakening passed like slow-burning embers, quiet, steady, fragile. The stallion's body remained weak, but something in his eyes had shifted. He was aware now, alert in a way that made seasoned handlers take a second look. His ears tracked voices. His eyes followed movement. When Holly's voice came through the speakerphone one afternoon, he turned toward it and stood. No one told him to, he just knew. Madison Reed watched it all from the edge of the stall. She hadn't left the facility in over a week, sleeping in the staff lounge, catching meals between updates from the vet team. Dr. Jonah Wells had begun documenting every stage of Valor's recovery. His notes filled pages. Vitals, temperature charts, fluid levels. But the real mystery wasn't just medical, it was behavioral. "This horse," Jonah murmured one night, staring at a monitor feed. "He's responding to stimuli in ways I've never seen from a wild animal. It's like he's reading the room." Madison nodded. "He's choosing who to trust." Valor's trust circle was tight. Kendra, Jonah, Madison, and, remarkably, the two small children he had once kept warm beneath 3 feet of snow. The Callahans had been released from the hospital just days before. Lucas, still shy and recovering, was hesitant to enter the stall, but Holly had no such fear. She walked straight in. 8 years old, tiny against the size of the Mustang, but her voice was steady. "Hi, Valor." The stallion turned slowly, no snort, no pawing, just quiet awareness. He lowered his head until it was level with hers. "You remember me," Holly said, almost like a statement. "You stayed with us. You didn't let the snow take us." Valor blinked. Then, deliberately, gently, he pressed his forehead against hers. Jonah nearly dropped his clipboard. Madison felt her throat tighten. After that visit, there was no more questioning the bond. But not everyone believed. The story had gone viral. Local and national media ran segments on the Blizzard miracle horse, footage of the rescue, of the Callahans reuniting with him, and of Holly stroking Valor's face while he stood like a statue. All of it played across TV screens and social media feeds. And then the backlash started. A popular blogger accused the story of being exaggerated. A national wildlife columnist published a scathing editorial calling the entire event a romanticized hoax, suggesting the family was trying to gain fame. "No wild stallion would knowingly protect humans," the piece read. "This is projection, not fact." Madison was livid. But worse than the skepticism was the call that came next, from Animal Control Enforcement Division. A regional official had reviewed the footage and expressed concern. "Valor is still a wild Mustang under federal protection," the agent said flatly over the phone, "and if he's exhibiting unusual behavior, that may be a risk to public safety." Jonah was furious. The horse hasn't so much as flinched at a person since he woke up. "That may be," the voice replied. "But if he's lost his natural instincts, he may be considered unsuitable for re-release and unsuitable for domestic placement." "So what's the plan?" Madison snapped. "Put him down because he's too good at being alive? Just a behavioral assessment, that's all, but don't get too attached." Too late. The Callahans were already filing for adoption. The request wasn't simple. Wild horses weren't pets. They belonged to the American people. Releasing Valor back into the wilderness was the default plan. But no one, especially Madison, believed he'd survive that. Not after what he'd been through. And not with how deeply he'd bonded to the children. The question echoed through the halls of the trauma center. What happens to a wild animal who chooses a family? A journalist named Travis Denton arrived uninvited 2 days later. He was known for cynical exposés, and his interest in the story felt more like a warning than curiosity. He cornered Madison in the corridor outside Valor's stall. "You're the ranger who found them, right?" "Yeah." "You sure you didn't stage any of this? A miracle stallion makes for good press." She stiffened. "You think I buried a 1,000-pound horse under 3 feet of snow during a blizzard just for the headline?" He smiled like someone who thought too much of himself. "Stranger things have happened." Before she could respond, Kendra's voice came from the stall. Madison, something's wrong." She turned and ran inside. Holly was on the ground. Frozen, silent, curled into herself. Lucas stood nearby, wide-eyed and trembling. Valor was beside her, unmoving, head low, nostrils flaring. She had a flashback. Kendra said quickly. "Some kind of panic attack. It hit her fast." Madison dropped beside the girl. "Holly, honey, you're safe, okay? You're not in the snow anymore." But it wasn't Madison who calmed her. It was Valor. He let out a soft, deep rumble, not a whinny, not a snort, almost like a hum. He moved with impossible gentleness and curled around the girl protectively, not touching her, but close enough that she felt his warmth. Holly's breathing slowed, then steadied, Her eyes opened, glassy but aware. "He was there," she whispered. "In the dark, I felt him." Travis Denton stood at the stall door. His expression changed completely. He didn't ask another question. Later that night, Madison sat alone by Valor's stall. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But when she placed her hand on the rough edge of his mane, he leaned into it, just slightly. "This world wasn't ready for you," she murmured. Then, with sudden certainty, she added, "But I'll make sure it doesn't forget what you did." The hearing room was packed. What was normally a quiet municipal chamber in Missoula, Montana, had been turned into a media circus. News vans lined the snowy street outside. Reporters packed into every chair and overflowed into the hallway. The case of Valor the Miracle Mustang had sparked a nationwide debate, one that now rested in the hands of a single state judge. The issue on paper was simple. Should a federally protected wild horse be legally allowed to remain in domestic care? But for the people who had lived the story, it was far from simple. For Nate and Elena Callahan, the stallion wasn't a symbol or headline. He was the living reason their children were still breathing. For Madison Reed, he was the most intelligent animal she'd ever encountered, more than instinct, more than behavior. For 8-year-old Holly, he was family. Outside, protesters gathered with signs both for and against. "Let him stay," one banner read. Another, "Rewild, not rehome." And then there were the opportunists, people claiming the story was exaggerated, or worse, fabricated for financial gain. Rumors swirled online, and talking heads speculated on motives, legality, and emotion. Inside the courthouse, the judge, a gray-haired woman named Judge Margaret Halden, adjusted her glasses and called the room to order. "Let's begin," she said calmly. "Petitioners, you may proceed." Dr. Jonah Wells took the stand first. He laid out Valor's medical history in meticulous detail. His injuries, hypothermia, the unexplainable survival, and his healing. "This horse should have died, Your Honor. But he didn't. Not because he was lucky, but because he chose to stay with that family, to protect them. In my 20 years as an emergency vet, I've never seen anything like it." He was followed by Kendra Liu, who described Valor's behavior in recovery, his sensitivity, his calmness, his deep response to the children. Then Madison took the stand. She kept her words short. "I've worked with wild animals for over a decade. They survive, they fight. But they do not shelter freezing children with their bodies for 3 days. Not unless they choose to, and this horse did. He made a decision that no wild animal should have been capable of." The judge took notes without reacting. Then came the curveball. A man stepped up to the witness stand, tall, weathered, in his 70s with a faded ranger badge pinned to his lapel. Hank Travers, a retired ranger who had served in the Bitterroot back in the 80s. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I wasn't called to testify, but I asked to speak." The judge nodded once. "Proceed, briefly." Hank glanced around the room. "We used to talk about horses like this when I was younger. Old stories, stallions who guarded injured hikers, one that supposedly led a search party to a lost child. We dismissed them as legend, mostly, but I think we were wrong." He looked directly at the judge. "Some animals, they just know." The crowd fell into a hush. The final testimony came from Holly. She stood beside the bench, small and brave, clutching her mom's hand. When asked why she wanted Valor to stay, she didn't ramble. "He's not just a horse," she said simply. "He's my friend." "And what does he do for you?" the judge asked gently. Holly swallowed. "He listens when I can't talk. When I get scared again, he helps me breathe." "And how do you know he wants to stay?" Holly smiled just a little. Because every time I leave, he watches the door until I come back. That was the moment that changed the room. Later that afternoon, the court convened for the ruling. Judge Halden leaned forward, fingers steepled on the bench. I've reviewed the facts. I've heard the testimony, and I believe this case falls outside the scope of current wildlife management law. She paused. However, in light of the evidence presented, and with the cooperation of the Bureau of Land Management, I am authorizing a new designation, Family Integration Status for Valor. There was a collective gasp. She continued. This designation will allow the Callahan family to adopt Valor under the condition that his safety, medical care, and well-being are documented and maintained. This ruling is specific to this case, but it may set precedent for future decisions involving extraordinary human-animal bonds. Elena burst into quiet tears. Nate squeezed her hand. Madison let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Holly just grinned. The next day, the Callahans brought Valor home. Nate had spent weeks converting his construction equipment barn into a full-fledged stable. Heated floors, soft straw, wide stalls, and reinforced beams. They hung a handmade sign over the entrance, Valor's Haven. The stallion walked off the trailer without hesitation. He didn't pace or panic. He simply stepped into the stable like he knew he belonged there. As if this was the destination he had envisioned in the storm, he sniffed the fresh straw, nudged Lucas's shoulder gently, and then positioned himself at the door to look out toward the house, his quiet sentinel stance returning. Later that night, Madison stopped by to check on him. Holly met her in the driveway. "He's already got his favorite spot," she said, pointing to the hill that overlooked both the barn and the family porch. "He stands there at sunset." Madison smiled, watching the black figure silhouetted against the pink and gold horizon. "Still guarding his family?" she murmured. Holly nodded. "He always will." A year passed, and the snow returned. But this time, it fell softly, blanketing the Bitterroot Valley not as a threat, but as a quiet memory. The blizzard that had nearly taken everything now lived on in the town's collective story. And standing tall among the drifts was the black stallion who had once laid his body across the cold to save 4 lives. Valor. He no longer slept in a trauma stall or flinched at the hum of heaters. Now he roamed the Callahan property freely, guarding the borders of a home he had chosen as his own. He had become a fixture in the community. Children from neighboring ranches came to feed him apples. Teachers brought field trip groups to meet him, whispering as though in church. But Valor didn't care for attention. He cared for his herd, especially Holly. She was taller now, her face stronger, though her eyes still held traces of the girl who had clung to life beneath the snow. Her scars weren't visible, but Madison could see them in the way Holly sometimes froze during windstorms, or the way she clutched her coat tighter when clouds rolled in. But she was healing, because Valor was always close, always watching. And the Callahans had transformed their pain into something powerful. They called it the Valor Project. What began as a dream on paper became a reality on the back half of their property. A nonprofit sanctuary dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating animals who had suffered during natural disasters. Abandoned dogs, fire-scarred horses, even a fawn found after a mudslide. Madison had joined full-time, stepping down from her ranger post to lead the field rescue team. "I saved them because he saved me," she said once, during a news interview that aired nationwide. The response was overwhelming. Volunteers flooded in. Donations helped expand the barn. A small therapy center was built, where kids like Holly could interact with the animals in structured, gentle settings. Teachers from Missoula brought classes out every month. And in the center of it all stood Valor. Never performing, never obeying commands, but always present. He'd become more than a survivor. He was a symbol. One morning, as frost laced the edges of the pasture, Holly stood with Madison beside the fence line. Valor stood still a few yards away, ears twitching toward the wind. "He knows when I'm sad," Holly said quietly. Madison nodded. "He always has." "I want to be like him when I grow up," Holly added. "You want to be a horse?" Holly laughed. "Number, I want to protect people, the way he does." "You already do," Madison said. "You gave him something no one else could." "What?" "A reason to stay." As winter deepened, the anniversary of the rescue approached. The Callahans planned a small celebration, but when word got out, it turned into something far bigger. News crews returned. People drove from out of state. Children sent drawings. One little boy mailed in a blanket for the big horse that saved the kids. On the morning of the gathering, Nate stood in front of the crowd with Holly beside him, Lucas shyly holding his mother's hand. "We didn't survive that blizzard on our own," Nate said. "We were found, protected, chosen, and now we choose to honor that miracle by helping others." He gestured toward the pasture where Valor stood under a white sky. "This is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of something we never expected. A partnership between humans and animals built on trust, not ownership. On love, not luck." Madison stood quietly at the edge of the group, hands in her coat pockets. Dr. Jonah Wells and Kendra Lou stood nearby, both smiling. Hank Travers was there too, his ranger badge pinned to a clean flannel shirt. That evening, long after the guests had gone, the family gathered on the hill behind the barn. They brought blankets and thermoses and sat beneath the stars. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air. Valor joined them. He stood just behind Holly, his shadow long in the moonlight. She leaned back against his shoulder, small hands resting against his chest. "You don't have to guard us tonight," she whispered. "We're okay now." Valor didn't move, but he stayed. Later, after the others had gone inside, Madison lingered at the fence line. Valor stood alone now, looking out across the land he had made his own. She stepped beside him, laid a hand against his neck. "You could have disappeared after that storm," she murmured. "Back into the wild. Let people wonder. Let the myth grow." He exhaled softly, his breath clouding the air between them. "But you didn't," she said. "You stayed." Behind them, laughter echoed from the porch. Holly's voice rang out above the others, bright and clear. Madison smiled and looked back at the stallion. "You saved them once," she said. "But staying, that's the part no one expected." Valor turned his head and looked toward the light, the family, the home. Then he stepped forward, just once, and stood between the barn and the house where he always stood. Still guarding, still choosing, still here. Sometimes miracles don't disappear. They stay, quietly watching, reminding us what love looks like when it sacrifices everything.